In this tutorial, the player will jump like this. Okay, when we are grounded, then at that moment we will able to jump, not in the air. Okay, so let's dive into this topic without furthering delay. Okay, so let's get into that. Firstly, add collider to on your ground. Go over to hierarchy. I already added a tile map collider, and you can add any collider to the bottom side. Okay, firstly create a game object, then add that collider, and we need to assign this ground. Okay, ground game object, I just name it. I'm gonna assign this. As you can see, I have collider. If I hit this play button, it just the player just is standing top of our ground. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to tag this ground, basically where we standing. I want to tag that as a ground tag, basically the ground game object. Okay, and we will check if we just landing on that ground, we should jump, else we do not. Okay, else we shouldn't. So as you can see, if I try to click on space key, I'm not able to jump. Okay, firstly I need to basically specify this ground as a ground tag. To do so, select this collider. Okay, but the ground game object, select that, basically this collider, and go over to inspector in the top, as you can see, which is untag. So click on that and click on add tag. Okay, and hit this plus icon. Let's name this to ground. Click on save. Head again to that game object one more time, which is our this ground game object, and let's assign this ground where we standing. Okay, firstly make sure you add it. Hit click on this add component. Find any collider like box collider 2D, tile map collider 2D. It's up to you what you want to add up. Okay, I already add up, so let's assign this collider game object which says untag, and we recently created this ground. So let's assign that with ground. As you can see now, I assigned this ground game object as a ground tag, as you can see in the inspector. Okay, so let's go to script. Okay, let's go to script and let's do it inside of update function. So when we try to click on space key on our keyboard, we should jump. Okay, the player should jump. So what we want to do, we will move to update function, and we know update function runs every single frame. So over there we will check. Okay, so we have to use this if condition and make some first bracket and some curly brackets. So into brackets you have to pass a condition which should be true. Okay, so we know 3 is greater than 1, something like, or 3 is greater than 0. So the condition in brackets becoming true. So whatever you write in between these curly brackets, it's gonna be execute, it's gonna run. Okay, so what we want to do, we want to check. Okay, so we will do in if input dot get key, and into brackets we have to pass the key code. So we gonna check for space key. If we click on that space key, we should jump. Okay, so we will pass key code dot space. Basically it's basically means if we just click on space key on our keyboard. Okay, so whatever we gonna write in between these curly brackets, it will execute. Firstly we want to check. Okay, so let's debug that. So for printing out message, we have to type debug.log. In quotation, let's say player jump. Okay, player jump, and let's close that off with semicolon. Control S to save your code. Let's go to Unity. So when we click on space key, or okay, when we press space key, that message will print out in the console, says player jump. So select the console in the bottom. If you can find the console, you just have to go to in the top window. Okay, window, then general, and you can find all of the tab. If you lost any of them, okay, you can find it directly by going to window in the top, then general. Okay, so just wait for to compile and select the console in the bottom and hit this play button, and if I click on that space key, that message will pop out, gonna pop out right away. So if I hit this play button, okay, hit this play button and select the console in the bottom and try to click space key, okay, so what we doing inside of, if we, it's basically means we just clicking the space key, okay. If input dot get key dot key code dot space, okay, it's basically means we just clicking the space key, and if it's the case, we just printing out the message says player jump. Okay, so if I select this console and try to click space key, as you can see, it's get print out multiple times because we're doing inside of update function, and we know update function runs every single frame, so that's why it's just the message just getting pop out multiple times. Okay, so instead of printing out message, we want to really jump. Okay, so what we have to do, we have to access the rigid body of this player game object, and we will add up velocity to that rigid body only to the y-axis. When we try to click on space key, we should not jump in the x-axis. As you can see, we only want to jump in the y-axis, so we will add a velocity to the y-axis with some unit. Okay, and we will add to the x-axis 0, so we're not gonna jump in the x-axis, we're gonna only jump in the y-axis. Okay, so I'm gonna set back to 0 this x, okay, and I'm gonna move it I'm gonna move it down a little bit. So let's open up our script one more time. So we need to get the reference of this rigid body of player. Okay, so firstly we need to get a reference of this rigid body, basically the link up. Okay, and then we will go to this rigid body and we will set the velocity in the y-axis of this player with some unit when we try to click that space key. Okay, so let's open up our script one more time and let's grab the rigid body, okay, which is rigid body, and you can make it public. So instead of making public, I'm gonna make it private, so we're not gonna able to see this field in the inspector. Okay, that is rigid body. Okay, rigid body, and we have to name it, let's call it RB. So what we will do, we will move to update start function. Okay, and we know a start function get called when the game start. Okay, in the start of the game, we're gonna get the reference, or we will get the try to get this rigid body component of the player. Okay, make sure you added rigid body component to your player game object. Okay, select the player, click on add component and find that rigid body and attach that. Okay, so we will move to a start function. In the start of the function, what we want to do, we want to grab the rigid body component of that player. Then we can go over to that rigid body and we will set the velocity in the y-axis of that player with some unit when we try to click on that space key. Okay, so let's grab that. So RB, we will do this basically means it's referencing itself, and by this dot we will get the component. Okay, component into arrows, we have to pass the component name. So in this case, we want to get that rigid body component reference. Okay, so let's pass that rigid body 2D and make some first bracket and close that up with semicolon. Okay, and control S to save your code. Now we have the reference of the rigid body of the player game object. Okay, we getting the reference of that rigid body, and then we storing into this RB. Okay, we storing into this RB container, you can call. Okay, so we getting the reference in the start of the game, and we know start function get called when the game start. So in over here, when we try to click on that space key, we just printing out the message says player jump, and after printing out message, what we want to do, we want to add up some velocity to that rigid body. Okay, in the y-axis only, not the x. Okay, y-axis with some unit. Basically we want to jump in the y-axis, not in the x, when we try to click on that space key. Okay, so what we will do, we will create a vector2 velocity. Okay, vector2, we know it has x-axis and y-axis, and we will call it something like vel, and we will set equal to RB dot velocity. Okay, basically we're going to player rigid body, and we're setting the velocity of that player rigid body velocity to this velocity. Oh, okay, well, as you know, and vector2 has x-axis and y-axis, so we're gonna only modify the y-axis. So we will go to will dot y. Okay, and we will set this equal to some unit, something like y in the y-axis. So I'm gonna set something like 10f. So instead of hard coding this, so we need to come over to the script again and again and match that up. 10y basically means how much should we jump in the y-axis. So instead of hard coding this, let's make a variable for it and let's make it public so we can adjust through inspector. That will be float. Let's call this one jump height, and by default I am going to set it to 10f. Okay, and let's replace this 10f with jump height, and we know jump height is 10. Okay, 10. So in the y-axis, player will jump. Okay, with setting the velocity of that player rigid body in the y-axis 10 unit. Okay, and then after doing that, we will set the velocity. Okay, so we will go to rigid body velocity of that player one more time, and we will set the equal to, well, firstly what we're doing, we're creating a vector 2 and we're setting to rigid body player velocity, and we just only modifying the y-axis of that vector. Okay, with this jump height which is 10. Okay, and then after modifying, we're setting that velocity of that player to this will. Okay, after modifying the y-axis only with 10 unit. Okay, which is the jump height, but we can adjust in the inspector. So that is the reason we made a variable. So control s on your keyboard to save your code, and let's go to Unity. And if I hit this play button in the top and try to click on this space key, we're gonna jump in the y-axis with 10 unit. We're just only modifying the y-axis, not the x as you seen. Okay, so I hope you get the idea, and let's try out. If I hold down space key on my keyboard, we should jump. We're gonna jump in the y-axis with 10 unit, but we can adjust over here in the inspector player script because we made it public. Okay, so so that is the thing. So just wait for to compile, and when it's done, hit this play button and try to click space key on your keyboard. We will jump in the y-axis with 10 unit. Okay, so now as you can see, jump height by default we set 10, but you can adjust it over here, it's up to you. So let's hit this play button and try to click try to press a space key on my keyboard. It will jump to the y-axis by 10. Okay, as you can see jump height, but you can adjust it. Okay, so if I, as you can see, we can jump, but the thing is that even we are in air, we still able to jump multiple times. But what we want to do when we are grounded, basically when we just landing or standing on the ground, at that amount of time we just gonna jump, not in the air like this. As you can see, we jumping multiple times, not even when we are not on the ground, standing not on the ground. So we only want to jump when the player just standing on the ground. Okay, so like this, but we're not gonna jump in the air. So what we will do, we will create a bool parameter, and we know bool parameter can be true or false. Okay, and we will set this over here. When we standing on the ground, we will create something like is ground. Okay, and we will set this true, and when we are in the air, we will set this false, and if it's false, we will check. Okay, so let's go to script to elaborate a little bit. So over here, as you can see, when we try to press on space key, we jump in. So we also gonna check. Okay, so we have to type this n. Okay, if we pressing space key at the same amount of time, so let's create a bool parameter. Okay, let's make it public. It doesn't need to be public. Okay, and that will be bool, and let's call it something like is ground, and by default I'm going to set it to true. Okay, so is ground, so we will check over here, is ground is true. Basically by as you can see, by default I set it to true. Okay, but when we are not in the ground, we will set this parameter to false. Okay, so over here we checking two statement. Firstly, if we pressing space key, okay, space key, at the same time is ground is true, but by default we set it to true. So both of this condition becomes true, so this line of code will be execute. So after jumping, I want to set this is ground parameter to be false. Okay, because we jump it and we are not the player is not in the ground. So the player is on air, you can think. Okay, so let's say this is ground to false after jumping. Okay, sorry, not true, we will set to false. So if we jump for the next time, okay, next time, so this is ground became false. So if we try to click basically if we pressing space key and is ground is true, but we know for the second time is ground we setting to false, so this statement over here is false. So both of these conditions should be true, else this line of code will not be executed. So for the second time we're not gonna jump. Okay, so control S on your keyboard and let's go to Unity. So when we jump for the first time, after jumping we setting is ground parameter to false, and over there over here as you can see we checking if we pressing space key at the same time is ground is true. Okay, but we know for the next time we setting this false, this is ground is not true anymore. Okay, so we also need to set this is ground true parameter to true, so that we will able to jump for the next time. Okay, so if I hit this play button now and try to click on this space key, for the first time we gonna able to jump, and for the next time we're not gonna able to jump, because both of those conditions should be true. And if it's true, and we know we adding y-axis velocity. Okay, so as you can see we're not jumping anymore even I try to click multiple times space key on my keyboard. Okay, because this is ground parameter became false, so we also need to set this is ground parameter to true. But when we shoot, when we just land on the top on the ground, then we will set this is ground to true. And we know, and if we press at that time space key and is ground is true, we will jump one more time. So we also need to set this is ground to true. But when we shoot, when we collide with that ground, okay, when the player like this is player, and if that collide with the ground, then we will set this is ground is true. And we know if is ground is true at the same time we pressing space key, then we doing this thing. Okay, and after that we setting is ground to false. And when we collide with that ground one more time, we will set this is ground to true. So when we on the ground, then we will able to jump. I hope you get the idea. Okay, so I'm gonna unplay this. Let's open up our script. But we assigned this ground as a ground tag, as you seen. If I select this collider or this ground game object, as you can see we assigned this ground as a ground tag. So what we will do, we will go to bottom of our script. Okay, and we will use this function. It's called on collision enter 2D function. Okay, sorry, not exit, on collision, sorry, on collision enter 2D function. Okay, sorry, on collision, sorry, this is not on collision enter. Okay, so this function over here get automatically call. Okay, when we collide with something, if the player, okay, if the player on the air, sorry, if I select this player game object, okay, I'm gonna set this to 0. Okay, so if the player, okay, let's suppose if the player is over here in the air, so it will fall down due to gravity and it will collide with that ground. Okay, with that ground, so this function over here get call. Okay, so this function get call when we collide with something, and if that player collide with something, this function get triggered out, and we can extract info whatever we have collided with by going to this other, like we can extract info like name, tag, collider component. So in this case what we will do, we will check whatever we have collided with, and if that game object has tag ground, as we know we assign it our ground game object as a ground tag, so we definitely gonna collide with that ground. Okay, so we will check over here if other, okay, we will go to other, then we will go to collider, and we will check if that tag is equals to ground, and we know we assign it that game object as a ground tag. So over here we know this function get called when we collide with something. If the player is on air and collide with that ground, so this function will get a trigger, okay, trigger. And over here we checking whatever we have triggered or collided with, okay, if that game object has ground tag, and we know we assign it that ground game object as a ground tag, so we definitely gonna collide with that game object. So basically means we standing on the ground. Basically we collide with the ground and we are on the ground now. So in this case what I want to do, I want to set this is ground parameter to true one more time. And we know if that is ground parameter to is true, and if I press space key on my keyboard, and then we will jump. And after that we setting is ground parameter once against to fall, means if we on the air we're not gonna able to jump because both of those conditions should be true. But when we collide with that ground, so this is ground parameter will be true one more time. So both of those conditions getting true. So if we click press space key on my keyboard, then we will jump one more time. So let's set when we collide with that ground, I will set this is ground parameter to true. Okay, let's set it to true. So Control S on your keyboard to save your code, and let's go to Unity. So when I on the ground, when I collide with the ground, we're setting that is ground parameter to true, and we're checking if we pressing space key at the same time is ground parameter is true, then in that situation we adding the velocity in the y-axis in the rigid body of player, so it will jump. Okay, in the air it will we setting is ground parameter to false one more time, and we if we collide with that ground we setting is ground parameter to true one more time. So both of those condition getting true. Okay, so we know if both of those condition getting true, then we gonna able to jump. Okay, so both of those condition, because we use it and means both of those conditions should be true. So in brackets that will be execute. So as you can see, when I collide with the ground at that amount or at that moment we just jumping. Okay, but when I am on the air, the player is not jumping. We only jumping when the player collided or standing in the ground, because we checking whatever we colliding with, and if that game object, okay, basically this game object has tag ground, and we know we assigned this game object as a ground tag. So in that situation we setting that is ground parameter to true, and we know what is doing. So I hope you get the idea how it collision works and how you can play around with bool parameters, okay, with some certain condition. And lastly, thanks for watching this video. I hope you get some idea of it. Okay, goodbye.